not going to be this person.
So yeah, I've spent a career changing events now.
Yeah, totally.
You know, I actually liked it. I thought it, and I wondered how it happened based on the book that doesn't fit me.
It's started a lot.
Oh,
I'm so worried about it. But I thought Sally
Oh.
and I thought the opportunity, she published a memoir.
Good for me to have records of him.
Oh, absolutely, I'm the digital.
I
Is
thought,
that
I had the opportunity to
I'm not,
I said,
Oh,
how in
well,
the world?
no, even this on Zoom could get us. And a couple people are virtual, right?
Because I thought she's resident about it. She said, how would you get that? She said,
Oh.
listen.
And I
So I
almost
also covered the anti-mandate.
That must
It's like, well, if they're just anti-mandate, I could see maybe if you're crazy, that's like, but they also didn't really believe in COVID, so the only people wearing masks were media. Yelling people, they gather at the Washington Monument where, of course, Washington demanded that the troops get vaccinated. And they're yelling, our bodies, our lives. 2 days after the anti-abortion rally, as they're walking to the Lincoln Memorial, and they're saying they appropriated MLK, saying MLK would refer to this because he believed in standing up for
I mean,
injustice.
as an actress, she wanted to just go right to marriage.
Tell me there were 10
She
people
wanted
there.
to get.
It was
Probably
It was decently crowded, but I didn't stick around for Kennedy
So it was just.
because after 90 minutes in close proximity with yelling maskless people, it's like,
So.
The shame of the Kennedy.
Here, we're going to put these.
I'm sorry that I have
So,
Yes, yeah. Well, there's that
It's
scene,
like a
that
halo.
veteran scene, and the exchange between them, and it's so powerful, and it's so unique. And
Well, since I signed up, I hope that puts me on the list.
she's not at all unionized.
I live very close, and I've written a World War II nonfiction book as an author, and
I'm a pretty big.
Imagine if they-
I like to take on the Mary Gators, and I actually have quite a bit of fun doing it.
Oh, there's a lot of talk.
only once did I take the road, the cuts off.
This is,
to get up.
remember the circle that people wanted to write names
A
on
lot of
the flag?
interesting insight.
Are there shelves there? I'd like to-
Yes.
Yes.
Is it
So,
so-
the installation.
Is this one of the first live event, I mean, events, because even a couple months ago, I would be like.
This is the last one. Do you remember the Sharpies that people were trying to write names on the flag? There's also a postcard.
Right, oh, shit.
It's on.
Yeah, you actually have to.
Well, you don't have, probably just in case I went.
Remind me to tell you a story that
Because they're
Remember, and it's left.
So, these are the Sharpies that we shipped out so people could write the names of what was on the flag. And then this was a postcard explaining it so people would actually get it.
I'm sorry, but I could, had to ask.
No, we have 500. Really fun.
So you're working here? So these are the postcards.
Never grow old. There's always some new twist. When I heard about this, like, for a second, I when I read about it, I thought, oh, they'll do the outside. What's that great little dog? What's that? It's an into the cherry. But these videos.
Suzanne can explain it.
What a love thing.
I don't want to interrupt. So these were during.
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
people write the names of loved ones on
That's
the
it.
flag.
Yeah, that's
And then when you did it,
so many times. I
Yes.
get it, but.
And so you know the story. So when Mary we would commute in from the White House, but we also moved all
So during the second installation, we actually had Sharpies that people were.
I have focus. I got off. Sharpies, who were doing it? They're great.
And then people would actually indicate on the map where they planted their flowers.
It's very expensive.
I was involved in here's the
Right, so
yeah, absolutely. And the bluegrass, given Kentucky or bluegrass is, I would think, one of the choice was I'm right. I expect not cover lots of things.
So these, Suzanne brought these, these were the Sharpies that we give people right now. This was the postcard explaining it, and then on the flip side, you indicate where the flag was. Did you hear that, Steve? Good for you. Thank you. Whoops, that screwed you up. I'm totally There are white flags. We provided commemorative Sharpies. And then these were postcards that explain the process, but then on the flip side, you do where you planted your flag. And this is, you also
Good morning. It's right at 10 o'clock, so we'll get started. My name is Callie Hawkins, and I'm the Director of Programming here at President Lincoln's Cottage. I want to thank you all for joining us both in person and virtually. And on behalf of our CEO and Executive Director, Michael Atwood Mason, who unfortunately couldn't join us this morning, I want to welcome you all to President Lincoln's Cottage and to the 7th Annual Lincoln Ideas Forum. I referenced the fact that we have some folks joining us in person and some joining us virtually. And I just want to take a moment. This is a practice that we have continued throughout the pandemic by thanking you all for joining us, those of you who are tuning in virtually, joining us likely from your homes. Today we are in one of the most intimate spaces shared by the Lincoln family. And I just want to acknowledge that our homes are these intimate spaces where we can be our full, authentic selves. And I just think that it's worth acknowledging that this morning as we all gather here to talk about something like grief. And whatever brought you here this morning, whatever made you decide that you wanted to spend 2 hours here with us, we are so profoundly grateful that you've come to this space and that you're here with us. So thank you. Each year, the Lincoln Ideas Forum brings together experts
and the public to delve deep into the challenges faced by President Lincoln and how they continue to be relevant to us today. Today's topic is grief. On this day, 157 years ago, President Lincoln made his last trip out to the Cottage, an essential location in his presidency and in his life. As we know, in the days following his last trip to the Cottage, the Lincoln family, as well as the nation, once again faced tragedy. This time, the tragedy of Lincoln's own death and the accompanying grief that followed. Grief is really a part of our origin story here at the Cottage, and the Lincolns came to the Cottage after the death of their 11-year-old son, Willie, in February of 1862. They came here to this house that we are in today in search of solace and a place to grieve. While the Cottage and the surrounding grounds did provide the Lincolns with some sense of peace and quiet, their living here also helped bring them closer to the human cost of the Civil War and the collective grief of an entire nation. Today, we are once again gripped by a collective grief as our country faces the dual pandemics of COVID-19 and centuries-old systemic racism rooted in the legacies of slavery. In light of this, we've brought together several experts, scholars, and I'm proud to say, friends, to cultivate a fierce compassion for the bereaved in a largely grief-averse culture. Today, we'll hear from 4 speakers, each with different perspectives and areas of expertise as related to the topic of grief. The views they share with us today reflect their own and are not necessarily the views of President Lincoln's Cottage. Before I introduce our moderator today, I would also like to encourage all of you to stop by our Visitor Education Center, which is just across the street, or another time if you're joining us virtually. We'd love to have you all here. While there, you can see our special exhibit called Reflections on Grief and Child Loss. This exhibit explores the Lincolns' grief after the death of their son, Willie, the grief of modern-day families who have lost children, and the stigma that continues to surround grief in our culture today. I also encourage you to check out our museum store. There you can find a variety of books, several of which have been written by our own esteemed speakers on the topic of today's conversation. So now, to introduce our moderator for the morning, Stacy Lynn earned her PhD in American History from the University of Illinois and was an editor and assistant director at the Papers of Abraham Lincoln for 20 years. She was an editor on the Papers of Abraham Lincoln, Legal Documents and Cases, and is the author of numerous essays and articles and 2 books, including Mary Lincoln, Southern Girl, Northern Woman. She is a member of the board of the Abraham Lincoln Institute and is writing a woman's biography of Abraham Lincoln to be published by Southern Illinois University Press. Currently, she is associate editor of the Jane Addams Papers. In 2014, her 20-year-old daughter, Mackenzie, a college junior, died while studying abroad in Spain. I promised Stacy that we wouldn't cry. No, we didn't promise each other we wouldn't cry. We promised that we might cry and that would be just fine. So we promised that not worry about crying. Anyway, we're gonna cry. It's fine. It's fine. I started a little earlier than I had anticipated. Stacy's loss and grief over Mackenzie coincided with the final manuscript work on her Mary Lincoln biography, which intensified her empathy for the Lincolns and provided a healing historical perspective for her own personal sorrow. Thank you so much, Dr. Lynn, for moderating us today. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, now I'm going to promise not to cry. It is an honor to be here today, and it's a personal joy, actually, to be here. And I'm very grateful to Callie, who has become very dear to me. This is an important forum, I think, on grief and loss, and I'd like to get us started, and so that you can know that this is going to be an open discussion, a personal human discussion. I'm going to share a personal story with you. In late 2013 and 2014, I was writing my biography of Mary Lincoln while my younger daughter, Mackenzie, was enjoying her sophomore year at Truman State University. Mac was majoring in creative writing and gender studies, and she was interested in my writing process. We had frequent discussions about the responsibility that I felt to write a sympathetic but a balanced portrait of Mary Lincoln, and Mac, as a gender studies student, was fascinated by my efforts to counter the popular narrative in the Lincoln story that Mary Lincoln was crazy and a burden to Abraham Lincoln's happiness. Mac would frequently call me or text me, and she'd say, "Is Mary dead yet?" And I would say, "No, not yet." And I would tell her the Civil War has just started, or Willie has just died. When I finally wrote the last scene of Mary's life, her quiet death in her sister's home in Springfield, where I raised Mackenzie, I immediately called her to break the news that Mary was finally dead. Mac at first said, "Thank God." And then she said, in a really sweet and serious voice, quite uncharacteristic for her, "You've done your job, Mama Bear. Mary Lincoln is now resting in peace." I sent the manuscript of my biography of Mary Lincoln to the press in July of 2014. And on September 7th, I put Mac on a plane to Spain to study at the University of Burgos. 2 babies released into the world. 1 month later, Mac died from Addison's disease, and I died too, becoming an unrecognizable shadow of the woman my daughter had known, now devoid of strength and courage and all hope. When the page proofs came for the Mary Lincoln book, like a slap across my face, just 1 week later, I possessed no will to care for that book that they would become. I crafted an email to my editor to tell her that she could do what she wanted with the book, that Mary was long dead, and nothing I had to say about her mattered. Nothing I would ever do would matter. But before I sent that email, Mac's spirit rose up in front of me and demanded that I complete what we had started, that she had had a hand in that biography, damn it, and I must pick myself up and get to work. She was right. I might not be able to do it for me, but I could do it for her. I crafted a new email to my editor asking for an extension, and then I spent the next month proofing and indexing my biography of Mary Lincoln, our biography of Mary Lincoln. It was a project on which to channel unbearable pain. In honor of my daughter, I tended to Mary Lincoln, and in the bargain, I also tended to myself. In that tending, my broken heart reached back in time to Mary Lincoln's broken heart, back to 1850 when her little Eddie died in Springfield, back to 1862 when her beloved Willie died in the White House, back to 1865 at Ford's Theater when Mary violently lost her husband to an assassin's bullet, and back to 1871 in Chicago when her darling Tad left her too. I had always empathized with Mary Lincoln, but now I understood for myself the cruelties that grief visits upon the body, how it manifests itself in the bones, steals away beauty and joy, and compromises a grieving mother's ability to cope. I knew Mary Lincoln suffered, but I now knew something much more important about her that I had never fully recognized before. Mary Lincoln was resilient, and she was brave. That month spent with Mary Lincoln, my darling Mac's spirit by my side, was the first step to rebuilding my strength and my courage. And the intellectual effort, that purpose, it gave me purpose, which is a supportive sister of hope. It was fortuitous for me that the final work on my biography coincided with the first weeks of my grief, because my emotional connection to Mary Lincoln during that time was a strange solace. It provided perspective. It taught me that grief is natural, it is universal, and that the deep and enduring love that fuels it is the very thing that makes us human. It planted the seeds of belief that I might be resilient and brave, like Mary Lincoln. She was a survivor, and her survival of unbearable loss gave me the courage to believe that I would also be a survivor. Such courage and belief brought me peace. And to this day, 8 years later, the painful, beautiful, very unusual connection between me and Mackenzie and Mary Lincoln is still a comfort to my broken heart. So I am here today, and I hope we are all here today, not only to share ideas about grief and loss in our modern world, but also to connect with each other through our shared humanity. We are here to discuss grief and loss in various contexts, not to discover ways to avoid it, but rather to embrace it as one of the essential realities of our human condition. The incredible panelists assembled here today will offer inspirational stories of survival, illustrate the interconnectedness of love with loss, and suggest some constructive ways and some creative ways we might navigate our own personal sorrows, but also the sorrows we collectively share in our families, our communities, our nation, and our world. I will not promise not to cry at some point in the next couple of hours. Callie and I have already started. But I do promise that the time that we spend together today in this beautiful place where Abraham and Mary Lincoln found solace will be rich and deeply rewarding. Our first speaker today is with us virtually. Her name is Dr. Joanne Cacciatore. She is an associate professor in the School of Social Work at Arizona State University, where she studies grief and loss. She is the founder of the MISS Foundation, which has been supporting families who have lost children since 1996. And she is the author of an award-winning book, which I have just begun reading and strongly encourage everybody to take a look at, Bearing the Unbearable: Love and Loss and the Heartbreaking Path of Grief. In 2016, she opened the Sella Care Farm, which brings together rescued animals and traumatically bereaved humans. Today, she is going to discuss the Care Farm and her latest research. Please welcome Dr. Cacciatore.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for welcoming me, and thank you to all the organizers of this event. Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. Thank you to all the organizers of this event for actually providing a safe place to talk about that which others so fruitfully avert, which is talking about grief. It's one of the hardest things. In fact, I have found that it's even harder in our culture to talk about grief than it is to talk about death itself. So now, Kelly and I had talked about I was gonna talk about the Care Farm, but there's a new thing that just came up. And Kelly, do you want me? I'm a little bit confused this morning because we had emailed back and forth about talking about the prolonged grief disorder debate.
Sure.
So which did you want me to cover? Sorry.
Why don't you talk about the Care Farm and then talk a little bit more about prolonged grief disorder?
Oh boy, in 20 minutes, huh? Okay. I will do my best. That's a lot in 20 minutes. Well, I'll just tell you about the Care Farm. The Sella Care Farm is a magical place located just outside Sedona, Arizona. And we have 50 rescued farm and domestic animals, mostly farm animals, who we've rescued from various levels from torture and abuse to deprivation, starvation, dehydration, and homelessness or slaughter. And we created this Care Farm so that grieving people could come here. Our particular Care Farm is specifically for those who are traumatically bereaved, which is defined by, as parents who have lost a child at any age and from any cause. And that also includes any kind of homicide or suicide. So we work with very violent, sometimes very high profile, the kinds of stories, awful, catastrophic stories you would hear in the news. And those families come here from all over the world, everywhere, from North America, all states in North America, to Eastern Europe, South America, Africa, East Asia. We've had people from all over the world who come here, and they help us to take care of the animals and the land, and they get very, very good traumatic grief informed counseling. And so that's what the Care Farm does. We have been in existence for almost 5 years, And we have a respite house now, a sanctuary called Andy Sanctuary that where people actually stay, so they get an immersive experience. People stay for varying lengths of time. The longest we've had, depending on their need, we do take people who are in acute crisis at times. And we also do groups here. We have a group-based program here. Key to the program, however, are the animals, the rescue animals, because we know that animals also grieve. There's plenty of evidence in the research that grief is not an emotion unique to human beings, that mother cows who are separated from their babies will walk fence lines and cry, and that an orca whale named Telequa, J95, will carry her baby's body around the Atlantic Ocean. I think it was the Atlantic, no, it was the Pacific Ocean for 1,000 miles over the course of nearly 2 months. Those kinds of stories provide some evidence, and there's some research on animal grief. And because we know that animals grieve, they also experience fear and loneliness. Anyone who's had an animal or been around an animal knows this. And there's this oneness connection that happens between grieving people and these animals that's very, very powerful. One of my latest research studies, it's not my latest anymore because I publish a lot, but one of my latest research studies, we had asked about sources of social support for grieving people. And we said, first of all, we wanted grieving people as the experts to be able to define their own grief experience and their own sense of social support. What did social support mean to them? Let them define that. And the second thing is we wanted to find out who is providing that social support that they so needed. And so we asked them, how is your social support from these different human groups? We asked about friends and family and colleagues. We asked about medical staff and mental health providers and hospital social workers and spiritual leaders in the community and in medical institutions. We asked about all kinds of human groups, every human group that could possibly come into contact with grieving people. And we also asked about pets and animals. And pets and animals blew every human group out of the water. They came in with an 89% satisfaction rate, 89%. And the closest human groups were in-person support groups and online support groups, which came in the percentages of the 60s. So that's really telling, when it comes to good grief support, be like a dog kind of thing. And so one of the things that we knew was that if we provided a space for people to interact with animals who have also suffered, well, we didn't know this. We know this now from our own research here at the Care Farm, but we had hoped that it would create a sense of oneness, a sense of connection and tenderness that animals could provide to hurting humans. And that's what we do here at the Care Farm. It's amazing. We have a website if you're interested. It's SelahCareFarm.com, SELAH. And we were recently featured in Oprah Winfrey and Prince Harry's docuseries, The Me You Can't See. So you can also watch us in episode 4 of The Me You Can't See. Which leads me to the discussion about prolonged grief disorder, because we don't practice in that way where we pathologize grief. It's very important to us to create what I call, in fact, I wrote a recent blog about this saying, don't give what is sacred. Don't give away what is sacred, which is your grief, to those who would desecrate it. So grief here at the Care Farm is sacred. It's holy. We have places for ritual. We have various restorative spaces in the Care Farm where people can pull their energy into deep contemplation and meditation, like the Lincoln Cottage, right? Like a place where people can go and find solace. We have places where people can connect and open their hearts to others broadly defined, not just other humans, but also animals and the earth, which is incredibly important in today's world. And so this new thing, you may have seen it in the New York Times where I was quoted. It's called prolonged grief disorder. And I'm very certain that Mary Lincoln would have been diagnosed with prolonged grief disorder if this was a thing back then. Unfortunately, let me say my arguments against it. I'm reading from a infographic from the American Psychological Association, the governing entity of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, where prolonged grief disorder, they say, quote, happens when someone loses someone else. Of course, no context given, no context about murder or suicide or the death of a child versus, for example, the death of Elvis Presley. And they experience an intense yearning or longing or preoccupation with the deceased person. This, to me, this is my editorial, feels like emotional colonization, that someone else gets to tell a grieving person when they're yearning too much or, quote, preoccupied with the person who died. And their bereavement lasts longer than, quote, social norms. Our social norms around grief are anything but normal, just for the record, and causes distress or problems functioning. And this language is very important because this goes back to 1973. There's a New York Times article in 1973 with the president of the American Psychiatric Association, Robert Spitzer, where homosexuality, this is back when homosexuality was a mental illness. And that's what they say, is that homosexuality itself wasn't a mental illness. This is actually what the article says. Homosexuality is not a mental illness, but it's a mental illness if it causes distress or problems functioning. And so it's the same sort of rhetoric. And of course, in the DSM-4, they removed homosexuality from the DSM because homosexuality is not a mental disorder, and neither is grief or prolonged grief. So let me tell you the criteria. Besides yearning and longing and problems functioning, it's identity disruption, feeling as though one part of oneself has died. Well, in the case of a child death or a parent death, that's true. Part of yourself did die. A marked sense of disbelief about the death. I don't know what parent whose child is shot in a school shooting, like Sandy Hook. I don't know what parent is supposed to, quote, believe that. I don't know how long it takes the mind and the heart to absorb the catastrophic reality of that loss. Intense emotional pain related to the death. I don't know, again, who gets to judge that, and why would you not have intense emotional pain? And why is emotional pain bad? Difficulty with reintegration. Well, we live in a grief avoidance society. And if we live in a grief avoidance society, how are people supposed to understand that they are accepted for how they feel and who they are now in this world? It's an insidious problem with society that we need to fix. Society rather than grieving people, in my opinion. Feeling that life is meaningless. Of course, people feel that way when the person they love most in the world has died, or perhaps they were a caretaker for someone for many years, and now they don't feel like they have a purpose in life, or their children died. I'm working with a bereaved father right now, and all 3 of his children died in one catastrophe. How is he supposed to feel that life is anything but meaningless? And then intense loneliness, feeling alone or detached from others, which is an interesting symptom that they postulate is one of the indicators of prolonged grief disorder, because there's a study currently going on out of Cornell Whale Medical School that's testing naltrexone. It's an addiction drug, and it's testing naltrexone to treat prolonged grief disorder on the basis that naltrexone is an addiction drug. They're assuming that, and they say this in the grant, they're assuming that prolonged grief disorder is a disorder of addiction. So the grieving person with prolonged grief is addicted to the person who died, which is incredibly problematic for me and offends me. My daughter's been dead for almost 28 years, and I still miss her every day, and I still think about her every day, and I claim that. And if anyone tried to tell me that was an addiction, I think I would have a few words for them. Beyond that, they actually say that the mechanism of action for this drug is that naltrexone interferes with a sense of social bonding to, and I quote, one's closest loved ones. So they're giving people with prolonged grief disorder a drug that actually creates one of the symptoms that's a criteria for the disorder. It's a circular, and in my mind, I don't understand it. I don't understand how it was approved by an IRB, but this is problematic and also indicative of the fact that we are an incredibly grief-averse society. I don't know Mary Lincoln personally, of course, and I don't know even much about her through history, but I can tell you that anyone who has lost 3 children and a husband by murder is being affected by the actual catastrophes she has suffered and the avoidance of the world around her, much more likely so than from a mental disorder. It's a human being's propensity to blame the victim and individualize, focus on the individual rather than the context in which the individual exists. So this to me feels a little bit unethical. And so some of my colleagues and psychiatrist friends, I have a lot of friends who are actually psychiatrists, and we have these lively debates about this. And one of my psychiatrist friends said to me, yes, I know, but they need services. And if the only way they can get services is by diagnosing them with a mental illness, then it's the noble lie. And I say, in what legitimate profession can you diagnose someone with something that you know is fictitious just to get insurance payment? Yes, of course, grieving people need help. I've been volunteering to help grieving people for more than a quarter of a century. And I've been in it 100%. This is the only work that I do. Yes, of course, they need help and support. But they need the kind of help and support that's honest and transparent, that doesn't cause them further harm. There was a research study that showed that prolonged grief disorder as a disorder actually caused more stigma than being suicidally bereaved. So people who knew someone was diagnosed with prolonged grief disorder desired more of a social distance from those people than they did even from people who were suicidally bereaved. We're actually causing potentially more harm to grieving people, and also for sure contributing to the myth about what normal grief is and isn't. And so my point to my psychiatrist friend who's talked about the noble lie is, what we need to do, there are some very smart people from some very powerful institutions. What we need to do is lobby together and push insurers to provide supportive counseling and intervention for grieving people that is not predicated on a fictitious mental disorder. And we need to start teaching society that this is what normal grief looks like. It's painful. Emotions are intense for a very long time, particularly when loss is catastrophic. That the reason that people feel that their life is meaningless is because they're in a transition period and trying to adjust to one of life's most devastating experiences. And it takes time. We can't rush this any more than we could break open a chrysalis too soon and you get liquefied caterpillar. It just is a bad idea as a society to colonize people's emotions, tell them what they should and shouldn't feel, and cause them to mistrust their own very sacred and holy experiences of grief. I want to be mindful of time, and I think I'm at 20 minutes now. Kelly, are you opening for emotions? Yes, are you opening for emotions, Kelly? I'm so focused
For emotions, but not for questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Right, breathe, right? Wow, okay. This is wonderful. I'm a historian, so I thought between panelists, I would take us back in time to Abraham and Mary Lincoln, who are really our spiritual hosts at the Ideas Forum today. I'll just provide a brief vignette, a quotation from a letter or something that cover kind of the themes that we're discussing today in order to kind of tether our discussions a little bit with the past. I won't offer any comment on them, although we can talk about them at the end if we'd like. On May 29, 1862, Mary Lincoln penned a letter to Julia Ann Sprigg, an old friend of hers from Springfield. "Your very welcome letter was received 2 weeks since," Mary wrote, "and my sadness and ill health have alone prevented me from replying to it. We have met with so overwhelming an affliction in the death of our beloved Willie, a being too precious for this earth, that I am completely unnerved, that I can scarcely command myself to write. What would I give to see you and talk to you in our crushing bereavement? If anyone's presence could afford comfort, it would be yours." Our next speaker is also joining us virtually, Marissa Renee Lee. She is a grief advocate, entrepreneur, and co-founder of Supportal, a platform that helps people respond when someone they love is faced with a life-changing challenge. She is the author of the upcoming book, just released, Grief is Love. Her personal understanding of grief comes from the illness and death of her mother and her experiences as a Black woman in America. She calls herself, and I love this, a rabble-rouser of social healing. We all could use a healthy dose of that. And the editor, Elaine Weatheroth, deemed her the friend we all wish we had in times of need. Here to talk about grief and racism, please welcome our new friend, Marissa Renee Lee.
That is the full backstory. Huge thanks to Joanne and Callie and everyone on the team over at President Lincoln's Cottage for inviting me and just for, continuing to elevate the topic of grief and host conversations focused on grief and loss. Because, to excuse me, to Joanne's points earlier, we live in a very grief averse culture. And I think there's a lot that needs to happen if we hope to normalize grief. And, I'm assuming you all are here because you know that grief is just a part of life, unfortunately. And as soon as we individually and collectively move toward acting like it is a normal thing, I think it will make it a lot easier for folks who are trying to figure out how to live with it. And so in terms of my chat today, I'm just going to give you sort of some background on myself and how I came to become a grief advocate. I'm going to share my thesis on grief, and I will also touch on a little bit of my book and sort of my book journey and how I got to this place where my book came out yesterday. So growing up, I had what I considered to be a pretty ordinary childhood, but one of the things that looking back, I realized was unique about it was this comfort around grief and loss and death. I was just 5 years old when my uncle died from AIDS. And I remember my mom, taking me as a little kid to visit him in the hospital before he died. I remember going to his funeral with my other little cousins and, not totally understanding it, but having these very distinct memories of the day and knowing that excuse me, something important and meaningful was happening. And so, I was raised by people who were very open about death and grief and loss, which I think really helped me when I was 13 and my mom was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. One day I had a normal, high functioning, working and, PTA, Sunday school teacher, et cetera, mother. And then the next day she was really sick and struggled for years. And ultimately that's what they figured out she had and what was wrong with her. And it was devastating. I was a kid, but I became sort of a third adult in the household, helping my sister with her homework, helping my mom get dinner ready for all of us, like doing laundry, et cetera. And, had an upbringing that was definitely something that moved fast and where more was expected of me at a really young age. And, it was the 90s. So we didn't talk about the grief that existed in that moment for our family. And then fast forward to college, and it was the week I was graduating. My mom had a particularly difficult health year, just constantly in and out of the hospital, having a hard time even getting out of bed. They couldn't figure out what was going on, assumed it was her MS, and it turned out it was actually stage 4 breast cancer. I will never forget being in this tiny oncologist office in upstate New York with my mother and my father, and my godmother was even with us taking notes because we all knew it was going to be something bad. And then this man, we thought she had cancer in her bones, and the doctor took her hand and put it on her left breast and said, "Can you feel that?" And when she said yes, I realized, oh, she has stage 4 cancer. Like, she is actively dying. And I was 22 years old. She had just turned 45. And so once again, grew up very quickly and committed to doing everything I could to support my parents. My dad is amazing, but he's a dad and like a dude in every possible sense. And so, really wanted to be there for them and help them figure out how to manage it all. And 2.5 years later, she passed away after sharing a joke with me. She had a seizure and died in my childhood home a few hours later. And I thought, given the person that I was, I'd spent all this time helping to care for her, mentally preparing for her death. I read Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's On Death and Dying. I'd done all the research. I was the person who was asking her what she wanted to do with her things and, what she wanted for her funeral. And I thought I was ready. I did everything I could. I had all of the spreadsheets and the lists and, had all the conversations. And then she died and I was lost. I was barely an adult, had just turned 25. She had just turned 49. And I didn't know what to do with myself. I didn't know what to do with all of these feelings, with the anxiety, with the depression. And so I did what so many people do when it comes to grief, especially women, particularly women of color. I just decided I was going to suck it up and, quote unquote, move on. I went back to work 2 weeks after I lost my mom and would proceed for months to have daily panic attacks, excuse me, in the basement of the investment bank where I worked. And even through all of that, I never thought to talk about it in any great detail with anyone. I didn't really think about accessing more help. I thought I just needed to grow up and be mature about what had happened and essentially bury it. And so I tried to just move on. A year and a half after she died, I got a job here in DC working for President Obama. I got my own apartment. I met a guy. We got married. It was all great until we lost a much wanted pregnancy in 2019. And I realized, as I was curled up on our bathroom floor, sicker than I'd ever been in my life, that all I wanted in that moment was my mom, a woman who'd been dead for over a decade. And I was miserable. The difference between pregnancy loss and losing my mom, like a big differentiator was just the physical experience of it. I was physically sick. We had lost this pregnancy. We didn't have any sort of backup plan. This was after years of infertility treatments and all the IVF, et cetera. And all I wanted was the comfort and guidance of a woman who I couldn't really access. And then, a couple months after the loss happened, the world shut down because the pandemic happened. And suddenly I was in this space of personal grief and global grief without any distractions or, any real escape from it. And so I was forced to just kind of sit with it and be miserable. And I started writing like crazy, I had to do something to get all of these feelings outside of my body. And what ended up happening is I realized not only was I not over the loss of my mother or the loss of this pregnancy, but I realized you're not supposed to get over it. I had this moment where, I'm sitting in my office right now. I was laying on the floor, face up, just typing random notes onto my iPhone. And I said, oh, you don't get over it because you're not supposed to. Like, what does it even look like to get over the loss of a parent, a child, a spouse? Like, what does that even mean? Are you just supposed to forget about them, forget that you had these people in your life who you shared a loving relationship with? Like, that logically doesn't actually make sense to me. And so I ended up writing an article about it that went viral, which led to the book that came out yesterday. And as I was writing the book, I realized, okay, so if you don't get over it, like, what do you do? And what is grief really, if it's not just this experience that happens right around the time that someone dies? And I came through the process of writing and conducting research for the book to realize that grief is the repeated experience of learning to live after you have had a significant loss. Because for me, there was the returning to work right after my mom died and just learning how to be a person out in the world without her. And then there are the big milestones that take place over the course of a life that, again, I have to learn how to navigate them without, this woman's active guidance and support and encouragement. So it is this constant learning and iteration process that you go through to figure out how to accommodate for the fact that this person you love isn't here to experience and be a part of these things with you. And what I also realized is that, at its core, grief really is all about love. I continue to love my mother in the present tense, and I know she still loves me, and no one can take that away from me. I experience the pain of grief though, because love is both action and feeling. And while I may continue to feel that love from my mom and for my mom, she's not here to act on it. I have a 7-month-old who's not napping today. I can't text her and say, like, these are the things we tried, like, what should we do? What's next? She can't help me navigate how to manage the craziness of a book launch and book tour with said baby. And that's why we grieve. Grief is the pain of unrequited, unconditional love. You know what it feels like to be in a relationship with someone that has that foundation of unconditional love. And now they're no longer here to love you in the way that you expect them to, in the way that you want them to, in the way that you know they can. And that hurts because it sucks and it's really hard. And so what I try to do in this book is take a look at, what is required and what does it look like to live a full and joyful life after experiencing a life-changing loss. And I tried really hard to ensure that everything in the book isn't just based on, my experiences with loss, but is also supported by research and data. And the underlying thesis around love is supported by this theory called the continuing bonds theory, which essentially says the best way to deal with grief and to live a full life after a loss is to figure out what it looks like to bring your people with you, to continue to share and feel that love, not to forget about them and act as though this is a thing of the past. And so I looked at things like, what has helped me and what does research say helps you get to a place where you can really do that on a daily basis. And it is things like having space and time to just be with your feelings and process. I think if not for the pandemic, I may not have come to these conclusions and this book may not exist, but I was forced to just sit and be miserable and work through all of that grief. Like, everybody needs that space. You need permission. In a society that is so grief averse, you need to be able to give yourself permission to grieve however you need to and to access whatever it is you need to heal indefinitely. Because at this point, my mom's been dead for over 14 years. And so I don't think the grief ever goes away. I'll let you know if that changes, but that's where I'm at this point. You also need grace. Like, grief is hard. Like, it's a hard thing to carry, but it's also a really hard thing to communicate around, which means, you are sometimes going to mess up and make mistakes and hurt people's feelings when you're dealing with your own pain. And so you need to be able to extend grace to yourself. You need to be able to extend grace to others when they don't support you the way that you want them to. And you need others to be able to extend grace to you when you are not able to show up for them in the way that you had planned to, because perhaps you're grieving something. And then the last thing that I realized, and this is a really important one, is that grief requires safety. Like if you are in a situation where you are not safe in this world, in your community, you will never have access to all of these other things. You won't have the space that you need to process. You won't be in a place where you can give yourself permission to really grieve and be vulnerable and fall apart a bit if you are in a community that is not physically safe, a community that is violent, if you are in a place that is, economically unsafe and you can't afford to do things like take time off from work or access therapy. And so by extension, that means that grief in this country, because of our commitment to white supremacy and capitalism, grief is harder for people who have already been made vulnerable by society. People who are poor, people of color, Black people, Latinx people, LGBTQ people. What does grief look like if you are a parent right now living in Florida or Texas and you happen to have a child that's trans? Like, you don't have room to grieve because your priority is keeping your kids safe. So I think it's really important in conversations about grief for us to acknowledge that right now, healing is a privilege in this country. And we all need to play a role in ensuring that it doesn't stay that way, because we are on track to reach 1 million dead Americans from the COVID-19 pandemic sometime within the next couple of months. And we know from the statistics and the data that the majority of those Americans are poor, people of color, veterans, undereducated, et cetera. And we need to make sure that those families are able to access the things that they need to heal from their losses. I think I am just about time. So I will leave you with, similar comments to what Joanne said. We really need to normalize grief. And we also need to ensure that healing from loss is something that is equally distributed in this country, that it isn't a privilege. So thank you.
Upon the death of Abraham Lincoln, Queen Victoria, who had lost her own beloved husband, Prince Albert, in December 1861, sent condolences to Mary Lincoln. "Though a stranger to you, I cannot remain silent," she wrote. "When so terrifying a calamity has fallen upon you and your country, and must personally express my deep and heartfelt sympathy with you under the shocking circumstances of your present dreadful misfortune." Mary Lincoln replied to the Queen on May 21st. "I have received the letter which your Majesty has had the kindness to write, and I am deeply grateful for its expressions of tender sympathy, coming as they do from a heart which from its own sorrow can appreciate the intense grief I now endure." So our next speaker is Suzanne Brennan-Furstenberg. She is a virtual artist whose work and experience is grounded in 25 years of hospice volunteering. Through her art, she says, she has been on a quest for understanding our grief-averse society. In the fall of 2021, she created an art installation of white flags on the National Mall to honor the people that we have lost to COVID. And we certainly could not have a discussion about grief and loss today without talking about the pandemic. Here to discuss her extraordinary exhibit, Designed in America, Remembered, please welcome Suzanne Furstenberg. I'm so sorry. I've gotten us out of order.
It's creative. Good morning. If these walls could talk, they would tell stories of individual grief, intense grief, of families torn apart, of a country divided, and of massive death. It sounds familiar, right? The pandemic has shown a truth-telling light on America's institutionalized inequities, racism, ageism, and as the speakers before me mentioned, our grief-averse society. 25 years of hospice volunteering, and not one but 2 In America flag installations have taught me that we in America don't do grief right. And so what I'd like to do today is share with you some stories from the flags that taught me how we can do grief better. And I also want to share with you things that give me hope, because I do have hope, and I have ideas on how we can make things better individually. My first art installation happened in the fall of 2020. Outside RFK Stadium, I installed 267,000 flags because I, as a visual artist, felt compelled to visualize grief. And I named it In America, How Could This Happen? Because that was my overwhelming feeling at that moment, like how in the world in my great country could this be happening? So 1, I wanted to visualize the grief, visualize and make understandable an incomprehensible number, which was the cumulative death toll in the United States. This was going to be a massive data visualization project. Number 2, I wanted a place where people could bring their grief. We as a nation needed a national place of grieving. And number 3, I wanted to physically manifest empathy for people. I wanted people to see that somebody cared. So that art installation was in situ for 5 weeks. We had plenty of guests, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, we had Jose Andres, and of course, Mayor Muriel Bowser. One quiet Saturday morning, we did also have Dr. Fauci and his lovely wife, Dr. Christine Grady. But the most important visitors to that art really were the people who came and dedicated flags. This was public participatory art. I wanted people to be able to dedicate a flag to the person whom they had loved and lost. This was really important because in a field of flags, if you're walking there and you see a flag that has a name on it, it instantly activates an empathetic response to every one of those flags. It gathers up in your mind the immensity of the loss. And so I really valued when people would share their stories and share their grief by dedicating flags. The art closed on November 30th of that year, and I spent the next 2 months cleaning, documenting, photographing, and archiving 2,000 dedicated flags. One thing that I want to note, though, is that I didn't realize that leadership from the National Park Service and the Trust for the National Mall had come and experienced that exhibition. And so within months of this closing, I was in discussions with them about bringing In America white flags to the greatest stage in America, which is the National Mall. I hadn't at first approached them about providing this art on the National Mall for the first iteration because it was my understanding that art on the mall got 3 days. A day to install, a day for photo ops, right? And a day to deinstall. But to me, the In America flags were not a photo op. And so I worked with them, and they very graciously gave me 20 plus acres, and over 23 days. That gave me 3 days to install, 17 days for people to experience the art, and 3 days to deinstall it. One of the things that was so important about this art was providing equitable access. So many people in the United States could not afford the time and money to travel to Washington, D.C. to dedicate a flag for their loved one, and how compounding that would be to their grief. So I partnered with Esri, which is a global mapping software company, and we created a website where people could go online and actually request that a flag be created for their loved one. We had these messages delivered to us there on the mall, and we had volunteers who would write out those flags and plant them within the installation. We also had a team of people from GW University, geolocators, they are students and faculty, who would laboriously find each of these flags that had been dedicated. They would take a picture of the flag, and then they would also and attach it to the data file, and then they would also push a button and the software would geolocate that flag, so that when a family a few days later went back to the website, not only would they see a picture of the flag that had been dedicated in honor of their loved one, as per their request, they would also be able to see the exact location amongst the 143 sections of flags where that flag had flown. In all, it's estimated that we had approximately 1.2 million visitors to In America Remember, there on the National Mall. And it is an image that will carry through history, companioning stories of the pandemic. Today, I am cleaning, documenting, and archiving 20,000 personalized flags in my studio in Bethesda. So if you have time and want to join me, I could use your help. It's a monumental task. This is an important moment in time that this art has captured. The installation closed on October 3rd at over 700,000. Today, as one of the speakers mentioned, we are approaching a milestone, a sad milestone, of 1 million deaths. It'll happen within days, if not weeks. Weeks, if not days. 1 million Americans lost. This is the largest mass casualty event in our nation's history, the largest. We're here in Lincoln's Cottage. There is a demographic historian, Dr. J. David Hacker, who has used newly digitized census data to arrive at a new revised estimate of Civil War dead. He places the Civil War deaths at 750,000. But I want to call your attention, you see the 1918 pandemic and the world wars, Vietnam and Korea, but I want to call your attention to 9/11. 9/11 here, just under 3,000 people died, and the HIV pandemic. Marissa mentioned visiting her uncle, whom she lost to AIDS. Think about how visuals of 9/11 are burned into your psyche. Now visualize the HIV/AIDS pandemic. It's harder to. And that's one of the big differences why 9/11 is such an outsized memory for us, but the AIDS pandemic is not. The AIDS quilt visualized for us the grief and loss, and thus the white flags have done that for In America. This is a picture taken from an airplane. This is, if you were taking off from National Airport, this is how you would have seen it. Today it is 40% larger. There is so much grief honored and acknowledged in this art. I want to share some stories about grief and what I think we can get better about it. I am not showing you pictures of the people that I mentioned just for privacy's sake. First of all, one day there was a woman in a long white gown and a white veil. She was dancing in one of the interior sections of the installation, and every once in a while, periodically, she would reach down and touch a particular flag. And from a distance, I thought, maybe she's a bride. Maybe it's her wedding day and she's come to visit the flag for her grandfather or something. And I meant to go talk with her. But I got waylaid, and by the time I got down to where she was already packing in, and she was on the perimeter of the flags, headed away. From a distance, she looked young. As I got closer, her movements from a distance belied that she was older. When I got close, I could see the tears in her eyes. She was a Japanese Cambodian woman, and she had been honoring her uncle who had died. And that was her ritual of mourning. She had been approached by two heavyset women who were intent on making her leave because they felt she was being disruptive and dishonoring the flags. So intimidated, she had stopped and she was leaving. A little bit more cultural understanding, curiosity rather than judgment, might have improved that situation. One day, a beautiful dark-skinned woman came and she said, I need a hug. She got it. She was from New York, a news producer. She was a new mother. Her own mother had died of COVID just a few months prior. When this woman was 8 months pregnant, that's when her mother died. And yet her mother was a doula and was going to help her through her first birth. She had been counting on her mother. She needed her mother. When she buried her mother, she went right back to work because she had no time off. And there at her desk was a condolence card, bouquet of flowers, a full inbox, and a day with scheduled back-to-back meetings. And she said to me, Suzanne, does the empathy really stop when the card gets signed and provisions have made for the floral arrangement? In American workplaces, we can do better. There is a woman named Joyal Mulherin. She founded an organization called Evermore that is dedicated to getting past legislation to provide for bereavement leave. It's one of the things we need to push for. Oh, there it goes. Men. 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 Let's talk about men for a minute. We've got to get this right. I met a pulmonologist walking through the flags, and tears were falling on his cheeks. Suzanne, he said, I lost my mother in May and my wife in June. I had to put my face back on and go straight back to the hospital because I'm a pulmonologist. I'm front line. I went right back. And he said, I had to come to the flags, and thank you, because this gives me space to experience, to feel my grief, because it is there. The next day, I was walking through the flags. There was a young man on the ground, sitting in the grass beside a flag. The flag was for his father. His father was the greatest jazz musician, he told me. His father had 5 kids. He was the oldest son. And he said, he's gone. I'm now the patriarch. I'm the head of the family. He said, he didn't teach me how to do this. He said, I don't know how to fill his shoes. And he wept. Another man I met, his wife had died just 6 weeks prior. After he buried her in Kansas City, he went into a deep, dark place psychologically. He said, I was crawling out of that place, so I got in my car. And I decided, hell with it, I'm going to drive around America. And he was driving around America. He had just happened upon the flags. He said, I'm in search of myself because I'm no longer a husband. We need to find ways for men to be more accepted in their grief. When in the flags, when I would encounter a man crying, I wouldn't give him a tissue. Always, always. Inevitably, the man would say to me, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, and try to stop his tears. And I would say, no, don't stop. I said, those tears are a beautiful testament to how much loving and caring you had for that person. I said, celebrate those tears. Don't stop crying. That's what we need to do with grief in America. But there's some things that happened in the flags that truly gave me a great, immense amount of hope. 3 things. Guy on a bike, an angry woman, I know, sounds strange, I'll get there, and a pair of glasses. So remember those 3 things. There was a woman named Cynthia, a beautiful blonde, middle-aged woman who lost her mother. So she was planting a flag for her. She got down, she was laying on the ground with her cell phone taking a picture of the flag when she was overcome with grief. So she just dropped her forehead to the ground and sobbed. But eventually, she gathered herself, and as she was standing up, she noticed that there was a guy kind of close to her. His bike was laying there on the grass, and he had just planted a flag. She's gathering herself, and he looks at her, and he says, you look like you could use a hug. And she didn't have any time for the social barriers, right? She said, yeah. He walked over and embraced her and gave her, as she reports, one of the most meaningful hugs of my life. Humanity can win out. Humanity can thrive. We just have to create the places where we can acknowledge and see other people's grief, and where we can treat others not as enemies, just as people whose stories we don't know yet. We can do this. Strangers comforting strangers, like that guy on the bike, that gives me hope, because it's there. Yeah, okay, we've gotten to the angry woman. Who wants to hear about the angry woman? All right, so very few people disavowed the art or disrupted the exhibition. One of the very few was a woman, an angry, angry blonde woman who marched up to me, pointed to the big sign and said, "Suzanne, you need to take out a flag. The flag that represents my mother, you get it out of here." Because she had COVID, but she died of a heart attack. So you take out that number's not right, you need to take out her flag. And I just looked, I didn't know what to do. And then it hit me. And I took a step closer to her and I said, "What is your mother's name?" She reflexively answered, "Mary." And then I said, "Tell me about her. You must have loved her very, very much." And the woman paused, and she looked at me with confusion. Then tears welled up in her eyes, and she started sharing stories. She and I wandered off into the shade of trees. And once she was done telling me about Mary, she wandered off. Anger is an imposter. We have to realize in this country there's so much anger, but anger is an imposter. So often it is fear or frustration or self-doubt, but it's dressed up as anger to give a person a feeling of control. So that woman gives me hope, because you know what? Instead of jousting with anger, all we need to do is recognize that that's not really anger. We need to take off the armament and deal with the pain underneath. That gives me hope, because individually we can do that. There was a lot of pain in these flags, and a lot of it was caused because of the political polarization. People brought pain because of loss. They also brought their pain and their sadness and their grief over our nation, because our nation has been divided during this pandemic. The Pew Charitable Trust shows just how divided we are. If you can see this, at the beginning, this is a timeline based on people who died in districts that supported Biden versus Trump. Early on, mostly Democrats died in highly populous centers, city centers, and because communities of color were disproportionately affected because of job and health disparities. But quickly, we get to about September 20th, and you see that the red dominates. Many more people died who were conservative in the more recent months of this epidemic. People died because of their politics. That's madness, people. That's utter madness. I was talking about this madness in my studio with a fellow sculptor a couple months ago, and while we were talking about it, we were surrounded by art from an exhibition or from an installation series that I had finished just before the pandemic began. I do more than plant white flags, okay? It's called the Empty Fix series, and it's about drug addiction. You heard an earlier person mention, I think Joanne mentioned addiction. I traveled to 24 different states, interviewed hundreds of people to create art that would decrease the stigma surrounding drug addiction. They taught me several things. They taught me, one, that psychological pain underlies a lot of addiction. Neglect, abuse, social isolation. These are things, bullying. These are things that make a person particularly vulnerable to addiction. And to help an addict separate from his or her drug of choice or behavior of choice, if you will, it's important, of course, to address these. But also, they taught me that they need two other things to be able to separate from their drug. One is a goal, a destination point. They need something to work towards, and most often that is a better sense of self. And they also need a new community, a community that's supportive and can help get them there. And let me, the definition of addiction. Addiction is broadly defined here as the continued and compulsive consumption of a substance or behavior despite harm to self or others. So there we were in my studio talking about this, and it dawned on me, I'd recently read somewhere that people, when they encounter information that supports their ideologic beliefs, they get a dopamine rush to the head. They actually get a dopamine surge. A chemical change happens in the brain. People, this is what happens when an addict encounters a drug of choice. It's the same thing. People are addicted to their extreme ideologies. Researchers in Berlin, a group of researchers in Berlin and London recently published a study in which they found that people with elevated dopamine levels were more likely to believe in conspiracy theories. This makes sense to me, and this gives me hope. It gives me an understanding, number one, that people who are perfectly rational can believe in perfectly, incredibly odd things. This explains this concept of addiction, which is the ever greater seeking for novel information that will help the brain handle that pain-pleasure balance that's moderated by the neuromodulator dopamine. It makes sense that people would need ever-increasing crazy stories to support that addiction. So yes, this gives me hope because it explains why people think that the government has the time and the interest and the money to put microchips in vaccines. It explains why some people can believe that 5G networks can cause people to spontaneously combust. It makes sense now why reasonable and smart people can think that way. But it also gives us hope because there's two things that we can do to overcome our loss of these relationships because of this madness, this political, this ideologic madness. One, we can help people find that goal. Instead of calling them deplorables, right? Or suggesting, oh, well, if you believe this, you're ignorant. No, let's celebrate people for who they really are. Good fathers, good mothers, people who do well at their jobs. Let's work to separate them from their ideology and help them create a new concept of themselves. And number two, community. They really don't need to cede from the nation, okay? This talk of having a separate country, it's craziness in itself. Instead, we need to keep lines of communication open and help people we need to set an extra plate at the table, and we need to model for them reason and caring, and as I said in the introduction, fierce compassion. I want to close with one thing, and that is at the opening ceremony to the flags, there was a man from Baltimore, Archie the Messenger. He wrote a poem. He lost his grandmother to COVID, and he was upset about the divisions in our country. He was grieving both. And he wrote, I know the angels came to get you because they came with wings to fit you. Thank you for leaving us enough light to get through. Thank you for another day, another chance to get it right. We honor you with the love that is hidden between the stars and the stripes. Thank you.
Sorry for the curved ball. Well, I can't really help myself but to share a few lines from one of Abraham Lincoln's most poignant speeches, the Gettysburg Address, which to my mind is a letter to a grieving nation. For those of you who are familiar with Lincoln and care about such things like I do, I read the lines from the Everett copy of the Gettysburg Address, which is owned by my home state of Illinois. We cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. So our final speaker, sorry about that, is Dr. Stephen J. Koza, who is a professor of psychiatry and pediatrics at Uniformed Services University. He is a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, is a distinguished life fellow in the American Psychiatric Association, and a life fellow in the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. He retired from the U.S. Army in 2006 after 25 years of military service. Dr. Koza is interested in the areas of clinical and community response to trauma in both military and civilian populations. He is here today to talk about his study in this regard. And thank you so much for being here with us. This has been amazing, hasn't it?
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today, and it's wonderful for me to finally visit the Lincoln Cottage, and it's obviously fitting that we're talking about grief here in a place that's so closely connected to the Lincoln family, personal tragedy, and the many, many lives that were lost in the Civil War. First, I want to thank my guests, the other speakers. It's just been an incredible experience to be here, and I'm honored to be speaking among them. In the brief time I have, my focus today is going to be on discussing the challenges that can affect people's adaptation to grief and potentially lead to a condition of prolonged grief that results in distress and dysfunction. So I should provide a disclaimer that I have no conflicts, and my opinions and assertions here are my own, not representative of the university or the Department of Defense. So I use this phrase from the quotation from C.S. Lewis, "The Vast Emptiness," to title my lecture today, because I want to start from a place of deep humility to recognize the depths of personal loss that people experience and to honor the individual pathways of those grief experiences. Grief is not a journey that people get over. Depending upon the nature of loss, many people actively grieve their entire lives with varying levels of intensity and unannounced suffering. Ultimately, grief is personal and situation specific. So I want to talk a little bit about where I'm from and how I began to explore the effects of grief was after 9/11, and it started with a phone call with Sesame Workshop. We had been working on a number of projects in support of military families related to the effects of deployment, the effects of combat injury and illness, and talked with Sesame about developing materials for young families who lost parents. And as a result, they worked with us and developed a product called When Families Grieve. It's available out there on the internet, and it's something that I would encourage people to take a look at. But while preparing for that project, we realized there had never been a systematic study of the impact of duty-related death in the United States, which was just astounding to me. So what followed were a number of studies that we completed, beginning with the National Military Family Bereavement Study, and moved on to Stepping Forward in Grief. And after doing some of that work, we were invited to work also with Voices Center for Resilience to study 9/11 bereaved families. And it's been an honor to be doing all of that work. The Center for the Study of Traumatic Stress, where I work, is within the Department of Psychiatry at Uniformed Services University. It's a science center that focuses on conducting research, studying the effects of trauma, disaster, war, terrorism, bioterrorism, and develops public and professional education materials related to those areas, as well as grief. And you can see the web address at the bottom, and there are many materials there related to a variety of those different areas. So my perspective about grief is largely shaped by my personal and professional experiences with community partners, both in the military bereaved community, the 9/11 bereaved community, and other traumatically bereaved populations. My perspective is also shaped by my professional collaborations with some of the leaders in the field of grief, including Dr. Kathy Shear at Columbia University, Dr. Holly Priggerson at Cornell, and my presentation reflects those conceptual approaches. The death of a close loved one, or the state of bereavement, leads to acute grief. We as human beings are intrinsically wired to create attachments to other human beings. So the resulting acute grief response is a powerful emotional and physical response to the loss. And here are some examples of the kinds of responses, and we've heard personal testimony to this: the yearning, longing, disbelief, distractedness, inattention, forgetfulness, loss of a sense of self. All of those are expected, normal responses after the loss of someone we love. But that the other thing we know is that acute grief is usually time limited. So we need to think about what is grief? And what is adaptive grieving? Grieving is an active process that includes two important elements: adapting to the loss and accepting the reality of the death, which is challenging, as well as restoration of life, moving forward with a sense of purpose and meaning and with possibilities of happiness. The Columbia Center for Prolonged Grief likens grief to the healing that takes place after a physical wound. And that analogy works very well as we understand that there are processes that can sustain and support healing as well as complicate the healing process. Under circumstances in which grieving moves forward towards those loss acceptance and life restoration goals, grief becomes increasingly integrated into a person's life. This doesn't mean that grief is finished, that bereaved people are over the loss. That doesn't happen. It does mean that yearning, sorrow, and thoughts of the deceased no longer take center stage in a person's life, as is typically the case during acute grief. They're still present, neither are gone, but there's room for other things. All bereaved people are likely to have their grief reactivated at any point in their lives by triggers in their lives that might have to do with reminders of the deceased, reminders of how their deceased died, at birthdays, other important dates, anniversaries of birth, anniversaries of death. But as grief becomes integrated, there are space for other thoughts, activities, even joy, despite continued awareness of the loss of the dear loved one. And so what we think about is that integrated grief over time finds its rightful place in a person's life. So if we consider the metaphor that adapting to loss is like adapting to a physical wound, it's understandable that just as infections can compromise wound healing, certain processes or factors can challenge grief adaptation. And those processes have been referred to as complicating factors or derailers, as they undermine normative processes of healing that typically help people adapt to grief. So the kinds of processes that derail grief adaptation have been looked at in research and have been identified in clinical practice, and include things like getting caught up in angry feelings. If only, second guessing, if only I had done this, if only I had done that, I should or I shouldn't have said this, self-blame associated with that, blame with others, excessive avoidance of reminders of the loss. So Marissa had talked about the fact that you have to get back out into the world and you have to practice being yourself in a world without that person doing the kinds of things. Some people really struggle with that and they avoid those situations because it's overly painful. Judging grief, too much or too little, not taking care of oneself, sleep, not getting enough sleep, exercise, or social contact. Okay. So I know there was discussion of prolonged grief disorder before, and so maybe I'm stepping into my own minefield here. But it's believed that this derailing of grief adaptation can lead to a condition of persistent and unremitting grieving. And brings us to the disorder, prolonged grief. So it is a clinical disorder that's been defined by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and the American Psychiatric Association. It is defined by unremitting, meaning the person is beyond 12 months from the death, intense sense of yearning, longing for the deceased, additional grief-related symptoms like avoidance, loss of meaning, loneliness, numbness, difficulty moving on, and the intensity of distress and disability. It's a fair question to ask. How is it that we can say that grief is a personal and individual journey, but then pathologize some people's pathways? Fair question. Purpose is not to pathologize individuals, but to distinguish this condition in its quality and intensity from normative grief. Studies have shown that it exists in about 4 to 7% of the population, higher in those that have been exposed to sudden and violent deaths. So why identify it? Why is it important? There are several excellent reasons. First, those who qualify for this condition have been shown to have poorer physical and mental health outcomes and are at much higher risk for suicide compared to other bereaved individuals. Second, PGD responds to evidence-based treatments. And in fact, when not treated, it tends to continue and persist as opposed to get better. Those treatments are not medication treatments. They're more cognitive behavioral therapy treatments where the individual learns about grief, understands it, learns to manage emotions, finds a way of seeing a promising future for themselves, strengthening relationships in their lives, and learning to live with the reminders and continuing with the memories of deceased over time. And the third important reason why we want to identify it is clarifying the diagnosis for healthcare providers is more likely to result in accurate identification of individuals who are suffering and who could benefit from evidence-based treatments. Accurate identification means neither overdiagnosis or underdiagnosis, but finding people who really meet the criteria and therefore can be identified and access care. There was a conversation earlier about stigmatization. If you speak with clinicians who work with people with prolonged grief disorder, they will say, finally someone has identified that there's something that we can call this thing. So diagnoses in their best situation are not intended to stigmatize, but they're intended to help people understand themselves in ways that allow them to understand what they're experiencing and then also potentially get whatever assistance would be important for them. So my interest in more problematic grief outcomes comes from my experience with sudden and violent deaths in both military families and 9/11 affected families. Sudden and violent deaths often involve the untimely deaths of young people, and compared to nonviolent deaths, have shown to have much more serious and intense grief reactions and higher risk for prolonged grief disorder. Given the circumstances of these deaths, it is understandable how anger, blame, self-blame, second-guessing, survivor guilt, as well as traumatic responses, all have the potential to serve as derailers when it comes to grief adaptation. In military populations specifically, they have their own set of challenges and potential protective factors that impact bereavement outcomes. So anger at the military establishment, self-blame of parents for having encouraged their children to join the military are all kind of challenges that certain family members experience. In addition, there are circumstances related to military life. So deaths often occur great distances from family. Sometimes there's not full information about what happened. It may take a while for bodies to be returned to family members. Family members wind up having to leave military communities or move off of military installations, moving to places that don't necessarily understand who they are or the challenges that they faced. Combat-related deaths may bring a sense of meaning and comfort to some family members, where the service member be lauded for their service and their sacrifice. But such recognition also brings some burden because families then have the burden of being the family of a fallen hero, which can have its own challenges, and it subjects the families to greater public and or media attention that can serve as complications, particularly if they have ambivalence about the military establishment or angry about the circumstances of the death. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the research that we had done in our work. what we had done was to try to understand how coping strategies in parents of service members who had died potentially affected their grief and grief-related impairment, functional impairment. And we were looking for these coping mechanisms specifically to see whether or not there would be targets for intervention in order to assist them with their grief. Were these derailers for people? What we found was behavioral disengagement, overthinking, and self-blame were highly associated with increased impairment, and active coping, use of emotional support, and acceptance were associated with decreased impairment. So I'm not going to share many data slides, but this is one slide I want to share, and it's to illustrate what we're talking about here. So this is to show the impact of self-blame on parental grief-related functional impairment over time. So if you look at the, is there a pointer on this? Is it? No, okay. If you look at the right graph, you can see when self-blame is present, and if you look at the left graph, it's when self-blame is not present. On the bottom, we had parents who started, or who were involved in the study that were only about a year out of the death, and then some that were as long as 10 years out. And and we see the level of functional related impairment from top to bottom. So what you can see is when self-blame is present on the right, impairment is higher and flatter. So people tend to do better without the presence of self-blame. So what self-blame is doing in this circumstance is it's undermining the capacity of the parents to move forward in ways that help them resolve their grief successfully. We found a similar difference in the effect of presence or absence of anger and bitterness as it was related to post-traumatic growth in these parents. Those parents without anger and bitterness showed a progressive increase in post-traumatic growth as time moved farther from the death, whereas those with anger and bitterness showed a flattened response, suggesting that anger and bitterness impairs resilient grief responses. So again, these are derailers for people in terms of moving forward with their grief adaptation. My second and last data slide is this is data associated with our study that we did with 9/11 bereaved family members. This was 15 years after 9/11, and we were asked to do an assessment because the community was saying that we still have people that are really suffering with grief in this community, and so we collected data from about 450 people who were family members of deceased. And we did what's called the latent class analysis, which essentially helps us understand different groups of people who are alike within that population. And we wound up with 3 groups. And on the bottom, you can see there's a green, in the middle is a yellow, in the top there's a red. So that bottom dotted line graph shows that about 2/3 of the people, even after this profound event of losing someone at 9/11, largely were doing well, which we expect in the population. Most people are going to do well over time. That doesn't mean their grief is gone. That doesn't mean that they're not suffering with their with the loss of someone. But it means that they are managing with their life in a way that allows them to move forward successfully, even with this level of loss. But about 13% at the top were those whose probabilities of meeting criteria for any disorder were elevated and had very high levels of grief-associated functional impairment. Smaller number, but an important number, because what we would say is that this is a group of people that are really struggling and would benefit from some sort of clinical intervention. So I wanted to talk, 9/11 families had many different challenges that they were faced with, but one challenge that was somewhat unique that I thought I would share with this group was that that human remains identification and return to families were quite low, that about 40% of the families have not received recovered remains, that only 300 of those that died in the World Trade Center, the full bodies of those individuals were recovered. And the vast majority of people that had received remains, who received remains, received fragmented or particulate remains. In many of those families, it wasn't just one identification and return, but there were multiple identifications of human remains that were returned. Families had a choice as to whether or not they would receive them, but some families received as many as 15 remains. So you can imagine what that would be like to over and over again receiving information, sometimes with disparate histories about or different places. They would find parts of the body that would just activate the people and activate grief and increase post-traumatic stress responses. So I want to read a quotation from one of our World Trade Center study participants. This was an individual who was in that upper red range that I talked about before. "I still cry every day when I am alone. I don't think this will ever go away. I miss my son so much. It doesn't get any easier for me. My loss is so tremendous, I just can't seem to be at peace. I think every day wanting to know what he felt when he was dying. Was he helping people, or was it fast? Was he in pain? Why didn't he call me?" The questions, the kind of continued focus on the painful aspects of the death. "I have so many questions. Even after 15 years, I miss him so much I often don't get out of bed in the morning and seldom leave my house." Okay. When we talk about prolonged grief disorder, this is what we're talking about. People who are immobile, unable to move forward in ways because their grief is so painful. And the importance diagnostically in distinguishing is to identify people to try to get them help. I wanted to mention, I'm pretty much or close to being out of time, but there were a few other terms that I wanted to introduce the group to. Maybe some of you have heard of them. They are not, they are associated with more complicated grief and loss outcomes, but they're distinct from prolonged grief disorder. But individuals who've had these kinds of experiences have been shown to be at greater risk for prolonged grief disorder. So ambiguous loss, I don't know if anybody has heard of that, was a term that was introduced by Pauline Boss a number of years ago, is an unclear loss that continues without resolution or closure. It is a relational rupture that can be physical or psychological. So circumstances in which people don't know information about the loss. People might not even know if a person died. For example, in our missing in action, our MIA Vietnam veterans, where families were unclear for years and years whether their fathers had died, fall into that category. Disenfranchised grief, a term that was introduced by Kenneth Doka, is the grief that individuals experience when they incur a loss that is not or cannot be openly acknowledged, publicly mourned, or socially supported. So we've talked about situations where there's stigma related to the loss, suicide, substance use related deaths, HIV, are examples where many family members were uncomfortable sharing that information or sharing details about it. So they were left in isolation with their own grief, and their grief was experienced as disenfranchised. Alternatively, disenfranchised grief can be circumstances in which other people don't recognize the significance of the loss. Perinatal loss is a very common example of that, where someone loses a pregnancy, and people don't acknowledge the fact that it has the same level of psychological significance as other types of losses. Okay, I wanted to, the topic of children in grief could actually go on for a long time and be a topic all of its own, but I think just a comment about that here is really important, because children suffer the same emotional and social and physical consequences of grief as adults do. But they're younger, they have limited capacity to understand grief. They have a little bit of capacity to understand the finality depending upon their ages. So the importance of being guided appropriately. Children are often missed, plain missed, in families where there's been a grief experience. And, you know, in circumstances where there's a parental death, the other parent, the caregiver of that child now is very often bereaved themselves. So they're overwhelmed by their own experiences, and it can be so challenging to meet the needs of children. Additionally, because there are developmental limitations on their capacity to express grief, oftentimes their expressions of grief might be perceived as misbehavior or oppositionality or anger, as opposed to representations of actually what's going on with them internally. Just want to mention as well that prolonged grief disorder has been studied in children. It's been identified in children, and children have been treated successfully for prolonged grief disorder. So PGD is not something that we use just for adults. Okay, I want to close with just a few comments. Although I've focused my discussion on those bereaved that struggle with grief adaptation, I want to again point out that despite the extremely painful experience of losing someone close, the vast majority of bereaved individuals move forward in their grief. Grief never ends, but most bereaved individuals adapt to the reality of their loss over time, often strengthened by the love, support, and memorialization of their families and communities. And I just want to close with a comment from a father who participated in our bereavement study and whose son died in combat. I am proud of my son for all that he accomplished in his short life, and I dearly miss him. He was my son, my friend, my confidant, my idol, and my hero, and I miss him every day. To honor my son, I keep myself busy doing things that people that I know, things for people that I know he would approve of. I want to make sure that his star continues to burn brightly. I feel that he's looking down at me, and if I do something that he approves of, he says, "Good job, Dad, good job." If the job is not what he expects, he says, "I know you can do better, Dad. Next time, try harder." For my life would be empty without children. I want to thank my colleagues, particularly Dr. Scheer, who's been an inspiration in my work in grief. If folks are interested in understanding more about prolonged grief, I would suggest you look at that website, Columbia University Center for Prolonged Grief. I want to thank you for your attention. My contact information is there, and I look forward to the completion of the forum.
Breaths. This has been an amazing couple of hours. I understand with the Lincoln Ideas Forum, this is your space to share and to just maybe open a dialogue. I will say that I, like Suzanne, have a great deal of hope that we can make our society a more comfortable place for grieving people. In my experience, and from what I've heard today, I think there are three really important ingredients to that. One is bearing witness to somebody else's pain, walking with them in that pain, not defining for them what that means. Two, our shared humanity. Grief and loss and love, they're all universal human emotions and experiences. And just like Mary Lincoln, just like me, just like all of you and your families. And I think the third thing, and one of the things that's been really important to me, and I talked about it in my opening, is action. Some kind of productive action. Sometimes that's just loving a surviving child with all of your might. Sometimes it's planting a flower garden. Sometimes it's writing a blog. Sometimes it's installing an incredible art exhibit. Action is our best hope for moving forward. So I'd like to turn over. Do you have people come or just stand?
Anybody can ask, questions.
Questions, comments, personal stories? Yes, in the back.
Yeah, so we talked a lot about how our society is grief, what is the word?
Averse.
Thank you. What are some societies that are not and that do it well?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not going to be able to offer much of an answer to this. Well, you talked about the Cambodian woman, I think you said, Suzanne, who had a morning ritual, an outward expression, a public outward expression that in her culture would not have gotten her removed from the exhibit.
I would say Tibetan Buddhism does an amazing job of sort of focusing on death and dying and grief as well.
And the Chinese, they burn paper balloons that, as though they're sending food and necessary items to their person in the next life. So some traditions are just richer than ours in understanding the relationship and supporting that transition.
Yes.
I would say Mexico. The
Oh.
Mexicans have a very
Yes, you're right.
intense and prolonged mourning period and celebration, and they have the annual Dia de los Muertos, which is a celebration of the ancestors and their spirits. And I would say also indigenous people from the continent of the Americas who have continuous responses and integration of the spirits and ancestors into their lives.
Yeah, go ahead.
Question, and thank you so much. I'm so moved by so much.
Yeah, I know. My heart is full.
I'm a criminal justice professional, and I'm curious to know if any of our speakers have any sense of the connection between accountability and people's ability to grieve and further process the grief. I never really knew. I worked in Bosnia for a while, where horrible things had happened, and I was involved in some of the efforts with accountability as well. And I just wonder if it helps, I know it prolongs the involvement in the grief because criminal justice processes and accountability processes aren't quick.
Yeah.
Just wondering.
I can certainly say that I know that in circumstances where people are really struggling with grief related to some sort of criminal event, or for example, 9/11, a terrorist event where there were, I'm not even sure if they're all completed at this point, the trials for the perpetrators of 9/11. In general, I think from a clinical standpoint, if it's practical, there's one thing to sort of kind of follow someone and talk with them about their perceived if only this happened or if only this happened. But if there are real issues related to accountability, like where someone did something that someone needs to be held up, those are important steps, I think, in grief adaptation. Person needs to feel like justice was served. Justice being served is an important way of settling grief, as opposed to injustice, a sense that something happened creates tremendous turmoil in people in terms of their own emotional responses to it. So.
Yes.
I'm just curious, because of Black Lives Matter, but how people of color feel in the case of their child being killed by police and all, and they don't feel like they got justice. I'm just curious to know what to say about that. Because I'm sure that grief is,
Sorry.
I know, because I'm sure that grief, based on the history of this country, is something that's worth acknowledging.
I think we need a whole lot more study of populations of color when it comes to grief. Much of the grief research we have, quite frankly, is about white men. The vast majority.
I figured.
Yeah, not surprising.
Men don't get it, but we had about 20%. In our study, we had 80% women and 20% men who participated. And we also, and I think some of this reflects just, continued concerns about the intention of science universities and medical institutions in terms of people feeling comfortable sharing what it is that's going on with them. We did one study where we actually translated all of our information into Spanish, had a Spanish-speaking researcher who was available, and we were unable to recruit any Latino community members into the study. We did an assessment of the Sesame workshop grief program, and it was a bilingual program, so we wanted to get input both from English-speaking and Spanish-speaking.
There's been a whole history of this process.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually have a comment. I was thinking there's a bell hooks quote that I'm gonna probably butcher, but it's something like healing is communal, it's rarely individual. And I was struck by, like, of our 5 speakers, 4 speakers and moderator, the talks were very, very different. I mean, in substance and style, but a thread that I saw throughout all of them was the necessity of community.
Yes.
And the necessity of society. And the group, it truly, you know, it is individual because it's so unique to you and your relationship with the person that died and your loss, but it has to be shared. It has to be shared with your society in order for anybody to move forward. And I just really saw that in every single conversation that we had this morning.
I think you're absolutely right that the grief is very personal. It's very internal, but the healing is communal. Absolutely, I agree. Yeah, in the back there.
Does anybody have any suggestions of how we as a community might help the influx, the ongoing and forthcoming influx of people who are in distress, who are here from Afghanistan, who are here from Syria, who are coming in from the Ukraine? And right now we are potentially expecting thousands of people coming on buses from Texas who are migrant Latin Americans. Who knows how that's going to play out? But anybody have any even overarching suggestions of things that we might do as a community here in Washington to reach into those communities and help them assimilate, help them get comfortable here, and help them start their process of grieving for whatever losses they may?
Anybody have any ideas about that?
I mean, what that makes me think of is what Marissa said about healing being contingent on safety. Like, the first thing folks are going to need is the physical materials to live
Excellent
safely
point.
and feel economically secure and have the physical objects that they need, and that is where everybody has to start in their grieving process.
I'll just mention too, there are some, if you look online, there's some great resources related to this concept of psychological first aid that we can provide. Safety is the number one, you know, making sure that people are safe because very often they're coming from unsafe places. Connections with other members of the community that they feel, so very often we, depending upon our own identity, may want to be very helpful, but maybe the best thing we can do is connect them to people that they feel most comfortable with. Unification, I'd say, is an important one, although we may have very little control about that, certainly with children, to make sure that families maintain and stay together. Also we need to be trauma informed when we think about, because many of these folks have come from situations where they've had traumatic experiences. So the degrees to which can help them feel safe, and then also develop strategies to manage their own emotional reactivity is important.
Yes?
Yeah, this is going back to the question about the Black Lives Matter movement, which I didn't hear a lot of the questions because of some helicopter going over. I just wanted to say that I think that sites of slavery are really important in helping people to grieve. Just the way society still is, and the fact that is based on, really early, things like slavery. So a memorial, a grieving place, just something visual that welcomes people to grieve, just the whole institution of slavery in this country, and helps them to understand the connection to many of the problems that we still deal with today.
Yeah, I often think of the word, oh gosh, now I'm blanking on it. What's the word that's used all the time these days? Gaslighting. you know, my daughter died just before birth, full term, and so I've been incredibly privileged and lucky in that the communities that surround me acknowledge her, celebrate her life, talk about her all the time. I am not the only person who mentions her name in a given day. But I know so many parents who aren't in that situation, and it just seems to me like gaslighting. It's, they have a child and everybody's pretending that they don't. And I'm following on your comment because it seems like connected to other types of healing, like sites of slavery or remembrance for atrocities. If you pretend that it didn't happen, somebody feels like they're living in just a completely different reality than everybody else, and how could you ever move on? But if you're acknowledged and your loss is acknowledged and it's put front and center, then it doesn't have to be front and center in your own life because it's just another part of your story. So.
Yeah, it's a really thoughtful comment. Yes, ma'am?
Yeah, I don't know when our country became so disengaged with the grieving process. Traditionally, black crepe was hung at a house, or, you know, black crepe was hung as a symbol. And that came from Europe, where in traditional culture, people who had suffered a loss in the family would tie a black crepe ribbon around the arm, and everybody in the community understood, this is a year of grieving. We have to be compassionate. We have to be supportive. And so we've lost this ability to relate with compassion in our society. And we've lost the ability to recognize relationship. The absence of someone is valuable. That doesn't mean you deny it. We have become, as a society, a place of repression. We don't deny that a baby died. We don't deny that a parent died. We don't talk about the children anymore. They're gone. You know, it's mentally ill. And as a society, we need to heal. We need to reestablish and realize that the cycles of life include the cycles of death. And compassion is essential to the health of the society.
It is absolutely.
So all I can do is what I can do individually in relating to people, in being open and supportive. But how do we get it back into our culture?
Well, and I think about Mary Lincoln because part of the reason why she was able to be resilient and she was brave and she moved forward in her life was because people recognized her grief in the moment. She wore black. She wrote on mourning stationery. There was that period of grieving that she was allowed. Now, Lincoln wasn't allowed that as a man in his position. He couldn't take time that he needed to maybe grieve for Willie because he had an entire nation to grieve for. But Mary did have that time. She wore widow's weeds for the rest of her life. And that's part of the reason why she was able to survive horrible loss, because she was allowed, to some extent, that grief. Yeah, in the Stripes?
Because of restrictions during certain periods during COVID, many families were deprived of having that beyond, you know, whatever the permissible number was. Are people studying this? Or even
Probably will, won't they?
And will a memorial service, if they have it, or a celebration of life, months or even a year or two after, help? Or are people closing the door and just saying, I don't want to reopen?
Can I address that for just a second?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
This weekend, a woman came from Connecticut, from northern Connecticut, to my studio, just to be able to visit the flag that had been written for her husband. When he died, April 11th, 2020, she was not allowed to have a funeral for him. And so they waited a few weeks, and finally they were allowed to have 5 people. unfortunately, she had 4 teenage children with her. And so if they were to come to the funeral, then they couldn't have the priest. So she waited, and a year later, she had a small gathering, and then this year she had a larger gathering to be able to celebrate it. And she said it wasn't at all optimal, but she was finding ways to deal with her grief in that manner. So that just gives you one idea of one example.
Okay. So one more yellow.
My partner died during the age of COVID. He did not die of COVID, but a few months after that, I had the pleasure of meeting Suzanne and going to both of the exhibits, volunteer at those exhibits. I just wanted to say that the stories that Suzanne shared with us today, every volunteer, myself included, heard stories of people that came up and we reacted with, and just personally for me, experiencing a loss, it helped me a lot in the journey I'm still on.
Yep.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
We couldn't have done it without volunteers like Harvard to grief and to witness the grief. Sometimes people simply need someone to witness their grief, to acknowledge it.
Bear witness.
Exactly.
Bear witness. That's all the time that we have today. Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you to our speakers, to Lincoln's Cottage, to the spirits of Abraham and Mary Lincoln, and to the spirits of all of the people that we have lost.
I will also invite